Well, good afternoon and welcome to our second series of live webinars. During this second series, we explored some of the challenges faced by the investment industry. We inspired you to use behavioral tech to help you digitally convert your diehard savers into investors, retain your investors, and rejuvenate your client base. I'm Laurent Lamblin and will be your host today. And for our final session of the season, we will focus on the most serious conversion and retention killer of all, emotions. The accessibility of investment services and the business impact of digital distribution channels have dramatically improved in recent years. But unfortunately, the lack of human encouragement keeps challenging client conversion and investor retention. How to make your investment processes emotion-proof? Mind, I didn't say emotionless. Today, Jurgen Vandenbroucke, who's appearing here also, who was also with me in the studio, will share actually how to channel these emotions and streamline investment processes using behavioral technology. He will inspire you on how to restore the human touch and your digital advice using some actionable behavioral insights along the investment process. Jurgen has over 20 years of experience at various entities within the KBC Group. Formerly the head of innovation at KBC Asset Management, Jurgen is now the founder and managing director of Everyone Invested, the KBC AM Wealth Tech spin-off. Jurgen holds a PhD in behavioral finance and published numerous academic publications on the topic. He teaches financial engineering at the University of Antwerp and is a renowned EDIC Risk Institute research associate. After Jurgen's session, of course, we will take some time for questions. So please don't hesitate to post your questions directly in the chat. And so let me invite Jurgen to take over the screen for the next half hour.
Okay, thank you, Laurent, and good afternoon, everybody, indeed. So for the next half hour, 35 minutes, I'd like to indeed share our view on how to retain the human touch in digital advisory processes. And the outline will be as follows. So it's structured in six nuggets. The first one is positioning. What's this all about? What's the challenge we are facing, which is to preserve the human touch in the advisory flow, but what does it exactly mean? We will briefly indicate what are the key elements that we indeed borrow from behavioral economics to turn this process in a more performing contributor to your business in investments when you take out the advisory assistance in the digital flow. And then we will briefly show how it applies to the profiling of your customers, the better understanding of your investment offering, and ultimately in building portfolios. And in conclusion, we will also hint on some recent initiatives, for example, by regulators and government agencies that very much encourage to evolve along these lines. So that's the, ambitious outline for the next 30-35 minutes. So let's start with the position. As Laurent said, the idea is to make your digital investment process emotion-proof, but definitely not emotionless. And we like to quote Andrew Lowe, which we will encounter later on in the talk as well, who once said that investing, and I think we can all relate to that, is an emotional process. And ultimately, managing this emotional component of investing, according to Andrew Lowe, is the greatest open challenge in financial technology. Differently put, you want your digital channels to contribute to your business line and investment. You want people in your digital distribution channels to push the buy button. And you should not only see people pushing the sell button when markets are more challenging, for example, like they have been over the past couple of weeks. So that's ultimately the goal. And to make this very tangible, let's consider the situation that occurs when in a branch, clients are visiting the advisor. If clients take the effort to come to the branch and spend time with the advisor, then actually more than half of the commercial effort has already been successful. The conversion rate of the advisor will be high, maybe as high as 80%. However, when you then simply take out the advisor and you restrict your digitization to a cold automation, then conversion will be very, very low. People feel that there's no human touch anymore when you simply automate the procedures that are applied in a branch and you simply take out the advisor assistance. So that's what we want to see back improved. So put it very simple. Since the 50s, as we will demonstrate, the model of wealth management and advisory has very much been in a setting where a human advisor talks to an investor in a framework which is built on rationality. And we like to make it such a visual that it treats the investor as if the investor were a machine, a cold-hearted, rational thinker. But the client is served by an advisor who adds the human touch in this communication and this portfolio report discussions. In the current state of affairs, we want to turn this around. We want to preserve the human touch and the human nature of the investor. And we want the advisory to become scalable, automated, and performing. So the robo is laughing in this visual, which should indeed be the case. Your digital distribution channels should be a main contributor to your fee business bottom line. So that's the challenge of today and the positioning of the current exposition. So let's then see how we can borrow from behavioral economics to indeed improve the performance of our technology. There's lots of things to be said about behavioral economics, and definitely it should not be considered a goal in itself. It should serve the purpose of making our advisory, digital advisory, more performing. But we will simply hint on a few things, and bottom line indeed will be that behavioral economics deepens our understanding of actual human beings. Mean by that? For example, one of the main inspirations of behavioral economics is Richard Taylor. He has very much made the idea of behavioral economics in the field much more popular through important publications like this one, Nudge. Many of you might be familiar with that. And the richness of behavioral economics cannot be captured, of course, in a webinar of 30 minutes, but one of the key elements that sparked this entire field was the challenging claim that actions should reflect your preferences. At least according to the classic approach, it was always assumed that indeed actions reflect people's preferences. And this was very much challenged by behavioral economics. And one of the famous examples is organ donation. This is here, for example, the driver's license from two different countries where the revelation of your preferences with respect to organ donation is organized differently. In one country, you have to tick the box if you explicitly want to be a donator, and if not, you are not a donator. In the other country, country B, you have to tick the box if you do not want to be a donator, and you are a donator by default if you do not click the box. It's an obvious example, and we all know what the result will be, but the classic textbook model, until behavioral economics came around, was assuming that if you want to be an organ donator, if that is your preference, you will take actions accordingly. So it should not matter how the choice is presented. If you are preferably an organ donator, then you will click and check the box in country A, and you will know not to check the box in country B. But of course, that's not what happens. You see in this visual here, which is based on actual research, the countries are not mentioned, but indeed it is, as you would assume, the case that the organ donations are much more popular in those countries where you have to opt out, and is far less popular in those A countries where you have to opt in. So preferences do not necessarily align with your actions. And that's a basic element of behavioral economics that can be applied and observed in many other circumstances as well. So let's take this more into the financial area. Let's, for example, take another famous use case introduced by another founding father, Daniel Kahneman. And the famous example is the following. You are part of a panel who has to decide on where to put the money for research and development in a vaccine, because a pandemic threatens a 60 million population. So that's the idea. You have a pandemic, 60 million people are endangered, and you have to decide where to put your money, in vaccine A or vaccine B. And in this particular case, we know that if we put our money on vaccine A, 20 million people will survive. However, if we go for vaccine B, 1/3 probability is that all people will survive, and 2/3 probability that no one will survive. When presented this way, most people go for option A. 20 billion people survive, even though you might have noticed the expected survival for A and B is the same, but still people go for the certain alternative. Same situation, but now presented differently. Now, still the research panel deciding on where to put the money for the research and development. And now for option A, 40 million people will die. And if you choose option B, 1/3 probability that nobody will die, 2/3 probability that 60 million people will die. So again, the expected number of diseases is the same for A and B. Presented this way, apparently most people select option B and go for the uncertain alternative. A famous example from 1981, which shows that, as you of course figured out, option A and B were exactly the same in both settings. However, in setting A, people tend to go for, in the first setting, people tend to go for option A. In the second setting, people go for option B. What can we learn from this? Again, your preferences do not reveal your actions. If you prefer a certain alternative, you tend to choose it when everything is framed in a positive way, in terms of survival. So people tend to be apparently risk avoiding going for the certain alternative if everything is framed in a positive setting. Whereas on the right-hand side of this slide, where everything is cast in a negative setting, apparently people are much more risk tolerant. They go for option B, which has an uncertain outcome. So apparently the attitude towards risk depends on whether gains or losses are involved. And indeed, this original research from 1981 was recently repeated by Everyone Invested last year at a large retail bank in Europe, where we did exactly the same kind of experiment, but now dealing with investments as one of our solutions that we offer. And what do we see? If you present people this situation, and now it's about investments, reporting a certain or an uncertain gain, then people go with a majority vote for the certain equivalent to the left. And if you show the same situation, but now dealing with losses, having to decide to go for a certain modest loss on the left or an uncertain and higher loss on the right, then people tend to go for the risky part, for the left-hand side. Sorry, for the right-hand side. So this is confirming that indeed, what we all know from textbooks, people are risk averse when it comes to gains. People are much more risk tolerant when it comes to losses, which in essence means that people are mainly loss averse. And indeed, Warren Buffett once tends to say, I love risk, but I hate to lose money. So that's the same kind of idea, summarized briefly to say that people have an attitude towards risk, and yes, people also complementary have an attitude towards loss. And that's one of the insights from behavioral economics that we will take along in a better performing robo-advisory flow that preserves this human touch. So let's then see how these applications could look like. And let's apply it first to people. And here we make the statement that we can improve on the measurement of an investor's risk-reward preferences both in content and in method. And yes, the method can be improved simply because we are talking about digitization, where technology offers much more possibilities than offering everybody the same hard copy questionnaire. And from a content point of view, with the example from the previous slide, we can definitely refine our understanding of how people behave in risky and loss-making circumstances. So let's address this one by one, both in content, and let's start with the method. With the method we can be brief. Most banks still use a questionnaire for risk profiling purposes. And more and more the business, clients, and definitely regulators encourage to improve. Improving in a way, for example, that uses a quantitative method, much more interactive, pretty much like the left and right choices that we shown in the previous slide. And we refer here to a publication, we could refer to many, but this is particularly interesting because it's a publication from a few years ago where the Dutch regulator AFM compared a number of quantitative methods and observed that in terms of risk measurement, in terms of credibility, in terms of predictability of future behavior, a quantitative approach is to be preferred over a qualitative approach, by which they mean a Q&A, and they rank the usefulness and the relevance of a number of methods, and obviously the one that prevails and ranks first is also the one that everyone invested implemented. And you can imagine that it looks then like this choices left and right, and maybe you have doubts as to whether your clients will be able to manage to make these choices, whether they will indeed understand and get through the process without advisor assistance. Well, from the same project that we've referred to on a previous slide, we have this interesting result, where over 1,000 clients of this bank were invited to a website, a temporary website, where they were presented both the existing Q&A method of the bank at hand, and at the same time also the quantitative method that we apply to measure this attitude towards risk and reward. And you see here the results, the answer to the bold question, which method do you prefer? And as you can see, ranked according to age buckets, pretty much all age buckets, apart from the few 80-plus-year-olds, but all age buckets convincingly gave a preference for the quantitative approach compared to a static Q&A approach. So even clients managed, of course, to go through this, and what was more, as part of this project, we had, of course, also additional NPS scores and more interactive evaluations, and one of the end results was that they preferred this quantitative method simply because it made them think, and it felt that their profiling linked better to the ultimate investment advice rather than based on a Q&A with hypothetical questions and each time a limited set of predefined answers. So clients appreciate that this is taken seriously and more personal. In terms of content, that's of course a major contributor to the conversion rate and success rate of your profiling as well. There we have here on this slide a number of examples that indicate that yes, there is lots of inspiration to be found in behavior economics and very much encouraged by, for example, CFA Institute, as you know, a rewarded institute that grows and teaches and trains the financial professionals of the future. Lots of publications that are very interesting, and not so long ago one was dealing with risk profiling, again inspired by behavioral economics. And around the same time, in 2017, a famous consultation paper by ESMA, the European regulator, where they also encouraged the business to look at suitability in the light of behavioral finance findings. So yes, improving profiling from a content point of view based on behavioral economics is clearly a trend. Then how to put this into practice? How to make this actionable? We like to tell the story of the founding father that we met earlier, Daniel Kahneman, and link it to his famous book, Thinking Fast and Slow. Because this title really captures the essence of a very rich view on investor profile. And in essence, it says that, yes, there are two ways that people process information when making a decision. There's a thinking fast processing, and there's a thinking slow processing. And let's try to address these one by one, again, dealing with personal finance and investing. And let's start with thinking slow, because that's very much today's focus. It's the idea that if you are confronted with a decision, with multiple options, multiple outcomes, then people sit down, they analyze the situation, they list the pros and cons, and they make an effort to make the rational, optimal choice. That's very much the paradigm of modern portfolio theory, originated in the 50s by Harry Markovits. And the pitch line is that people prefer more to less, but dislike risk. If the risk is the same of all options, they will prefer the option with the highest average. And if the averages is the same amongst several options, they will choose the less risky one. That's the idea that builds an entire business since the 70s. And yes, today it's very much still the main focus of risk profiling, with low, medium, and high kind of risk tolerance, or very defensive, dynamic, very dynamic as classifications. So that's very much the focus still today of risk profiling. And it actually relates to the people's long-term balance of growth and stability, mean and variance for those more technical colleagues amongst us. And yes, this is very important, that you know what is the right balance of this person, of this investor, with respect to long-term growth and stability, because that balance has to be right for that person to be convinced to push the buy button today. And yes, to consider investing a valuable alternative to saving. So very important, but it's not the only thing. There are also situations where the fast thinking prevails. In those situations where people have to act quickly, intuitively, emotionally, and make use of automatic responses. Those situations exist as well, definitely also in finance. The view, as I said, was originated by Daniel Kahneman and many others. And the pitch line in that word is that losses loom larger than gains. Because in the previous setting, stability was the measure for risk. And doing better or worse than expected is both contributing to riskiness. Here in the behavioral world, well, very few clients, I think, have complained that they had more return, more gain than expected. There's an asymmetric processing of gains and losses. And on average, losses loom larger than gains. And today, this kind of information is typically detected by an advisor talking to a client. Because not all clients with the same classic risk profile have the same, well, concern of losing money. And an advisor talking to the client can figure that out. However, in your robo-advisory, with the advisor assistant out of the picture, we have to also get this information to the surface, which is exactly what these kind of methods, quantitative methods, help you do. And it helps you get the information on how clients balance the midterm gains and losses. And I guess you want to know, because if that balance is not right, your client at some point will go to the mobile app, push the sell button, and be a saver forever. So you better also get that information to the surface, even when there's no advisor around to figure it out. So put in context, in summary, this is the kind of picture I think we should make in our minds when positioned at the left of this cloud we are considering to invest. And when profiling your investors, there's this thinking slow aspect. How does the client look at the long-term balance of growth and stability, mean and variance? And at any time between now and that long term, there will be fast thinking taking place. And there we show how the balance is with respect to the midterm gains and losses. So thinking fast and slow, in summary, are two aspects of investor preferences. And you can draw the parallel to a better understanding of your products as well. Here we make the statement that products have emotions too. And I will try to make that tangible. Of course, it has to be adapted to your personal offering. But the idea is that you should improve your profiling of your investor with these two dimensions, thinking fast and slow. The same idea, as I will show, can be used to understand your products better. And why should you bother? Well, ultimately because the next step will be portfolios, which are nothing else but combinations of products aligned with the preferences of the people, of the client. So what does it mean that products have emotions too? Well, very similar. Again, take this crowd as a reference point. Today, in most banks, products investment solutions receive a product score. For example, a score from 1 to 7. And typically the higher the number, it's indicating that there should be a higher average return or growth, and as a consequence, less stability or more uncertainty. So that's the long-term balance of growth and stability reflected in a risk-based product score. But in the wide offering of investment solutions that you have at banks, you also have a differentiation of products along the balance of upside potential and downside risk. Or how do these products deal and react to the fluctuations of financial markets? And one idea could be, well, let's give these products also a label. A label in this case that indicates, as I said, how these products react to changing market conditions. And in this particular case, we got our inspiration from our mother company KBC, where we have Hold to Grow, Adapt to Trend, and Adapt to Protect products, which can all share the same common product score and still be different in how they treat the midterm gains and losses. Very briefly, not getting technical, but just showing you how the emotional component is playing here. In a Hold to Grow product, it's a static, classic combination of asset classes. Adapt to Trend is a strategy which is based on rules and where the asset allocation changes in favor of the best performing asset class. So you can imagine having equity and bonds, and if equity outperforms, you go potentially to 100% of equity. You have many momentum strategies, well, this is that kind of strategy. And Adapt to Protect, again, expressing emotions in a different way. And these could be, for example, products where you add an extra asset class, cash, which you allocate to limit interim losses to a predefined level. So really to say, look, in the long term, sometimes it pays off in terms of performance to temporarily not be invested in the market. You can agree or disagree, but it's just showing the idea that you can imagine products, 3 variations with the same product score, in the sense having the same long-term balance of growth and stability, but having different attitudes towards interim gains and losses. And that is the same of idea as thinking fast and thinking slow that we applied previously to people. And then thirdly, it all comes together, as I said, in building portfolios, where the classic approach is to have static allocations that comply or align with the slow thinking of the client. Equity, bonds and cash in a proportion that aligns with the long-term balance of growth and stability. But between now and this long term, there will also be fast thinking of the client. So in order to keep the client on board, maybe you want to also change and update your portfolio construction. And what I mean is very simple. As I said initially, the classic paradigm looks at a static asset allocation as being the optimal portfolio. This is an old example from 2014 in a newspaper in the Netherlands, but I like to use it because it's an objective, neutral source for the information, and it illustrates my point. You have here a comparison of 5 financial institutions, and it shows the pie charts, the asset allocation that each of these institutions link to the classic risk profiles ranging from very defensive to the left and very dynamic to the right. And we see what we, of course, expect to see, that if you look at a certain bank, as you move from left to right, you see more and more equity coming in and bonds going out. But you also see that if you compare across financial institutions, obviously there are huge differences. Also because the equity allocation in one bank can be, of course, fundamentally different from the equity allocation in another bank. But the main message is, it's a pie chart. If you have a risk profiling that only looks at the slow thinking, very defensive and so on, then the idea is that with each profile, there's a static allocation of asset classes that is considered optimal. Now, if you then introduce the idea of thinking fast and thinking slow for your investor, and you acknowledge that your product offering is also more rich and more diverse, then we might also want to build portfolios accordingly. portfolios that give an idea, an outlet to this emotional component of your clients. And there you see again now a face to the name Andrew Lo. He's a famous professor of MIT, where he's combining actually thought leadership in the area of behavioral economics, behavioral finance, and algorithms, the better understanding of human behavior. But also at the same time, he's the lead investigator at the Artificial Intelligence Lab of MIT. And the combination of the two, algorithms that empower digital processes, preserving the human touch, is what he calls artificial humanity. And the provocative statement that he then says, well, when it comes to building portfolios, what's missing? It's not artificial intelligence, his words, but it's rather artificial humanity. And what he means by that is algorithms for investor behavior, so we can counterbalance our least productive actions like loss aversion, overconfidence, overreaction, all kinds of elements that we know from behavioral economics. So the bottom line is basically two things. The optimal portfolio should address this human touch, this human element in the investor behavior. And in many, many cases, that will mean that a static portfolio is not optimal. If the client with a large emotionality is offered a static portfolio, he will not get to the long term, and he will have pushed the sell button in your platform anytime in the future. So we need to address this human element or emotional element in the investor behavior. But second element or second point is that it should preferably be based on algorithms. We should not wait until the moment arises of a market crash to decide what to do. We should preferably have algorithms inspired by behavioral economics, but algorithms that already predefine that in these and these circumstances we will act in that way. That adds to the explainability of our portfolio, and it adds to a better alignment between the rules that govern your portfolio and the profiling of your client. And ultimately, the optimal portfolio is then not static but adaptive. That's the idea, to make optimal adaptive portfolios. And that can be done in a number of ways. One way is, as it was recently introduced to the world by Franklin Templeton, a famous global wealth manager, as you know, who have developed a methodology based on what I've been describing so far. It actually made them win the famous Markowitz Award in 2018, and it now powers their globally deployed robo-advisor. And what you see here is a picture from a publication that you can find on the web if you want. And it has lots of messages to be told, but the key element I want to highlight is that you see here from left to right the composition of a portfolio represented as a pie chart, but with the key observation that the color shades and the color combination, and as a result the allocation of the portfolio, crucially changes as we move in time, because the allocation adapts to the changing market conditions and using as a criterion goals-based investing, as for example is shown here on the dashboard. Put simply, if you have a goal that you want to achieve and your portfolio value increases, then the algorithm will show you to delever and to lower somewhat of your riskiness. If on the other hand you have a goal you want to achieve and your portfolio drops in value, you will have to change the allocation in order to still optimize your probability of goal achievement. So just to say, the asset allocation changes in a predefined way, like advocated by Andrew Lo and the idea of artificial humanity. The allocation is less of a picture and much more of a movie, and it's the client who takes the major part, the major role, because it's the preferences or the goals of the client that guide the adaptivity of the portfolio. Another example of how to implement this is this example from KBC, where we have also introduced this kind of idea of two-dimensional thinking, both with the profiling, the product understanding, and the portfolio construction. This is showing you here a part of a communication towards clients, I want to highlight simply what's on top here. It's for a dynamic investor with a balanced attitude to loss. That's just a more detailed thinking fast and slow of Kahneman put into practice. What you typically have is plain language communication towards a client, preferably very visual. And in this particular case, we always like to use these three visuals that in plain language translate the ultimate balance that the client wants to make. He wants to find the right balance between three things. On one hand, upside potential, and we all know it's never enough, but we show what the upside potential is reasonably looking forward. We also are very explicit on the downside risk, and we know it's always too much, but you have to find the right balance. And a third element, which is typically an element that again behavioral economics brings to the table, is the time dimension. What's the time engagement? How long does it take for recovering from extreme losses, for example? Or how long does it take for the upside potential to emerge? And we know that it's always too long. But investing, yeah, it's a trade-off. Not just between upside potential and downside risk, but again, behavioral economics adds the time dimension, which is also an element that introduces this human touch in your robo-advisor. So in summary, to conclude, we have seen how to preserve the human touch in digital robo-advice, trying to get the client addressed with all its dimensions in a way that is advice, digitized and scalable. We have taken inspiration from behavioral economics, where we know actions do not always reflect your preferences, and we have applied it to people, risk profiling, products, product classification, and portfolio construction. And let's be inspired. Let's get in touch and see how it could improve your digital processes, because it makes sense to do so. This last slide hints on a few initiatives recently observed that encourage the business to think along these lines. Maybe some of you were involved in providing an answer to the European Commission on their consultation earlier this year that addressed the topics of measuring risk awareness and managing personalized investment portfolios, where actually the European Commission very much welcomes the possibilities that technology brings in terms of financial inclusion and digital literacy, but at the same time, and rightfully so, they also monitor, well, the potential systemic risks that come with that. What if all clients push the sell button because the human touch is no longer there? Or with the proliferation of investment platforms and so on, what about investor protection? So there's a balance to be found here as well between the means of technology, financial inclusion, digital literacy, and improved content to preserve investor protection and to remedy the systemic risks. So at Everyone Invested, we are very much convinced that behavioral finance findings, or call it artificial humanity, will be crucial in achieving these goals. And with the activities in academia that Laurent also mentioned at the beginning, we are contributing and spearheading this evolution together with you. So happy to turn it back now to Laurent to see whether in the chat there were any questions raised or suggestions made.
Yes, actually there were some questions raised, Jurgen. Thank you very much, first of all, for the presentation. Don't hesitate to post any questions that you have left in the chat. I'm reading them now. You are applying behavioral finance to people, products and portfolios, but where would you start? With people, with products, or with portfolios?
Well, I think it makes sense to start with the client, in the sense that being client-centric implies that you start with the client. The portfolio construction, if you do it well, it should be able to receive whatever profiling of the client that you end up with as an input to portfolio construction, be it goals-based, be it another way that reflects the behavioral preferences of clients. But it's particularly the risk profiling of clients, of course, that feeds the entire system, either through an advisor or, in our world, preferably through improved technology. So I would definitely start there to get the other things aligned.
And I had one more question here. Obviously, there are some solution vendors also online today. One is asking, are you also open to partner with solution providers?
Yes, we are. What we seek there is complementarity, in the sense that everyone invested clearly focuses on certain aspects of digital advisory or digital investing in general. We already have partnerships in place, and what we always look for, as I said, is complementarity. 1+1 should be more than 2. There's plenty of players around, not all of them qualify to be a partner for everyone invested, just like we, I don't think, qualify as a partner for everybody out there neither, but always open to talk. Innovation starts with exploration.
And it also starts maybe if that person has not connected with you on LinkedIn. I just put your LinkedIn QR code so that we can connect with you. So this concludes, because I don't see any other questions coming in, this concludes today's session. Recordings will be made available later to the attendees. And please, when leaving, give us your feedback. This will help us improve our future sessions. We will all be back for a third series of webinars in September with a lot of experts joining for interactive talks, and more about that later. And in the meantime, follow us on LinkedIn for more updates on our upcoming events. Once again, thanks for joining and enjoy your holidays, and looking forward to see you again in September. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.